In this training, we're going to take a look at how you can quickly and easily build responsive grids with Automatic CSS. And this is actually one of those kind of more extensive tutorials because there's a lot you can do with grids in Automatic CSS. So what I want to do is I want to pull up my screen here and we can actually see the to-do list for this training. So we're going to cover just simple responsive grids, how to control grid gaps with Automatic CSS. You have equal column heights. So any of you who are creating a grid and you want all of the cells to be equal heights, that is very easy in Automatic CSS. We're going to talk about grids on sections in Oxygen, how you can build responsive uneven grids, responsive column spans and row spans, grid cell order, column starts, and row starts. All of this is available to you in Automatic CSS. And that's not the extent of grids in ACSS. We have auto grids, which we're going to cover in a separate training. And then we have more power coming to our conventional grids in ACSS in the very near future. But this is going to be a really good foundation to start from. So the first thing you have to understand is that the grid structure is determined by a parent element. That parent can be a section, which we'll look at in a minute, or it can be a div inside of a section. The div inside of the section would be the most common use of creating a grid. If you create a grid on your sections, you're going to be a little bit more limited in what you can put inside of that section versus you can put anything you want in this section and then this div controls whatever needs to be inside of that grid layout or that grid structure. So the first thing I recommend doing, especially if you're following along with this tutorial, maybe it's the first time you're creating a grid with Automatic CSS, is just add a blank div. And this is the parent container for our grid. And this is the container that gets the grid class for the number of columns you want your grid to have. So all of our grid classes start with grid double dash. If I want a 2-column grid, I put grid 2. If I want a 3-column grid, I put grid 3, and so on. And right now in Automatic CSS, you have up to 6 columns at your disposal. We're looking at expanding that into a full 12-column grid in the very near future. But right now, you have 6 at your disposal, and that's more than enough for most use cases. So I'm going to start with a 3-column grid. So we're going to do grid double dash 3. And you're going to see automatically that this grid spans the entire width of the page. That's very important. Now, if you don't want that to happen, you can actually use one of our other classes with auto, and it will make this grid conform to the size of its children. So if you're going to have a very small grid layout, maybe just a few links or something, and you wanted to use grid, I don't know what the use case would actually be. There are a few of them where you don't want your grid to stretch the entire length of the wrapper or the site width. You can simply put with auto on your grid, and it's going to shrink it back down, and then it's going to adapt to the size of the elements that you put inside of it. That's not the most common use case, but it is available to you if you need it. So I just wanted to make sure that that was covered up front. So I'm going to take off that with auto class. So we're just going to get the standard grid structure that you'll see when you add grid 3 or grid 4 or grid 5 or grid 6 or whatever. The next thing you're going to want to do is put items inside of your grid. This could be images, if this is just going to be an image-based grid, or more commonly, you're going to put divs inside of your grid, and these divs are going to become the cells of your grid, and then you can put whatever you want inside of those cells. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the add button, and I'm going to add a div here. And you can see that automatically when I add a div, because I asked for a 3-column grid, it takes up 1/3 of the space of the parent wrapper. So you can see that the grid structure is working. Now, I don't want to reinvent the wheel here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that blank div. I'm going to copy this div out of here, and I'm going to paste it. And actually, I'm sorry, I thought I was on Oxygen 4.0, and I'm not. I'm in 3.9, so I can't copy paste. So I'm just going to duplicate and drag. But there is my first cell. Now, all I have to do is duplicate this 2 more times, and you see that I have filled my grid. If I continue duplicating, it's just going to wrap to the next line, and it's going to continue with my 3-column layout that I asked it to create. Now, the next thing we have to talk about is grid gaps. So if we want gaps between these items, as you can see, they're all touching each other at the current time because there's no gaps in our grid. Grid gaps are very, very powerful. In the days of Flexbox, you used to have to put margins and negative margins, and you had to just do a lot of work to make what appears to be a grid layout, but it's not actually a grid layout in terms of what CSS is capable these days. So a true grid layout, you simply define gaps, and it's, well, you'll see right here, when I put the gap on the grid parent, again, this does not go on grid items or grid cells or anything like that. It goes on the parent container along with your grid 3 class. So we're stacking classes on the same element. All right, so what I'm going to do is put gap and double dash, and then I can choose the size of the gap that I want. You have XS for extra small, small, medium, large, XL, XXL, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and do a medium gap on this grid, and you see right away that all of my cells are now spaced out. But the grid did not get bigger. It didn't get wider, right? And none of the gaps are on the outside, right? So it doesn't look like my cell now has, or my grid parent has any padding. That is the power of gaps. It knows to only put the gaps inside between the actual cells. So that's very powerful. The next thing you can do if you want to change your gap size, this is very important. You don't want to just throw another gap class on here. It will work if you use a bigger one, for example, because typically it goes smallest to largest. So the larger ones come later in the cascade, therefore they'll override the smaller ones. But it's just not good practice to have a gap M and a gap L on here at the exact same time. You're kind of putting a conflicting rule set on your grid. So if you started with gap M and you really want gap L or vice versa, you would want to just delete the one that you don't need and just leave the one that you do need. So like here, I don't want gap L. I actually want gap S now. So I'm going to do gap double dash S, and I'm going to get my S gap, and I'm good to go. And I don't have any other gap classes on there. So that's the way that you can apply gap to your grids. Now, keep in mind, your gaps are all automatically responsive as well. So they're not fixed units. They will get a little bit smaller on mobile and a little bit larger on desktop because they use clamp functions. They use the same automatic CSS spacing system as your margins and your padding. So everything is perfectly even in an automatic CSS website, right? Margin bottom S is exactly equal to gap S, which is exactly equal to padding S. And that's really, really, really nice because it keeps everything super crisp and uniform. All right, so let's say we wanted to change our grid structure. See how easy this is. Maybe I decide I don't want a 3-column grid, I want a 2-column grid. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and I'm going to add grid 2 instead of grid 3. And you can see now I have 2-column grid. What's really important to understand here is that I have not set a width on any of these items. This cell right here simply has padding in it. It has a white text color. It's centering all of its content, and it has a base background color. There's no width. There's no height. I'm letting the grid control the size of the elements. Okay, very, very important. Now you can absolutely set a width on your elements. So if I did a width of S, for example, on this one cell, it'll absolutely make that cell smaller. It will no longer take up the entire width of that grid column. And then you can use certain classes to position this inside of that cell. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. We'll cover that in a more advanced grid tutorial, but that is absolutely possible to do. For the most use cases, you're not going to be putting widths on your grid cells. You're going to let the grid determine the size of your cell. And so if I wanted a 4-column grid instead of a 2-column grid, I would take off 2 and simply add 4. And now I have a 4-column grid. Next thing we want to talk about is equal heights. All right. So let's say that we have, I'm going to duplicate this cell right here. Not the cell, the text in the cell, because I want to make that cell taller. And if I add more content, it's going to make it taller. And you can see now that the other items are not matching up to it, right? You can see there's a gap below them, and it doesn't seem to match the gap that's in the rest of your grid. This can kind of throw off the visual representation of your grid. And so a lot of people wonder, hey, how do I get all of these cells to just naturally be equal height? So that if one cell in a row gets taller, how do all the other cells get taller automatically as well? The wrong way to do this is to come through and try to put a height of 100% on all of these cells. That is the method I see a lot of people start with or try to use who aren't as familiar with CSS Grid. You definitely want to avoid that at all costs. What you want to do is grab your parent wrapper again, and we're going to use a class called stretch. And stretch is part of the flex alignment family, but it also works well with CSS Grid. And basically what it does, it goes in and it asks all of those items to flex grow to the size of the row that they are in. And so what we're going to do is put a flex, we're not going to put a flex, we're going to put a stretch class on our parent wrapper, not on each individual cell. That's key. I know you want the individual cells to grow, and so you would think, I got to go put this instruction on the individual cells. You don't have to do that. You put it on the actual grid wrapper. And once you say, hey, this is a stretch grid, all of the children behave accordingly. So I put that on there, and you can see immediately all of those cells which have room to grow will absolutely grow, okay? So we have our top row where we can see that we have taller cells, but look at this. If I delete my extra content here, they'll all go back to normal. So they all adapt and stick with each other. This is one of the powers of CSS Grid. So that's equal column heights. If you want equal column heights in your grid, you use the stretch class. All right, the next thing is grids on sections in Oxygen. So if we were to not have this parent wrapper, all right, so we're going to go to our structure panel. And we're going to take a look at, here we go. Here's our, I'm just going to bring one of those out and then we'll delete this. And then I'm just going to duplicate this a bunch of times. 2, 3, 4, 5, and we'll do 6. So now I have a bunch of these cells inside of a section. And the question is, can I put the grid utility classes on a section in Oxygen and still have it work? And the answer is yes. So if I do grid 3, and this is actually, this is a step that we had to spend a lot of time on because of the way Oxygen structures sections with an inner div. There's an inner wrapper inside of these sections. If we just use the normal grid 3 class on a section, it would try to act like the inner div was the first cell of a grid, and it would totally screw up the entire layout. So we spent a lot of time developing all of this special Oxygen-specific CSS to make sure that our grid structure could, or sections, could properly handle our grid structure and that you would have no issues when creating grids on sections. And thankfully, everything has worked out really well and it works seamlessly on sections and Oxygen. So you can see I've created my 3-column grid. If I put the gap class on my section, it will apply the gap inside that inner wrapper to the content that I'm trying to manipulate here. And then if I wanted to go from 3 to 5, for example, I could absolutely do, well, it's not gap 5, Kevin, it's grid 5. It helps to use the correct class. All right, so I put the grid 5 class on there, and now I can go to town with more cells if I wanted to. So again, this works on sections, it works on divs. You are a little bit limited when you apply this to a section, simply because if I wanted to put a heading above my grid in this section, as an example, I can't really do it because the heading becomes part of the grid. It becomes a child of the grid. Literally any element that you throw into a grid will be treated as a cell. So, you have this heading that's just trying to stick into a 1/5 part of this grid. That's not really great. Versus with the other grid I had where we weren't using a section, we were using a div inside the section, I'm free to put whatever else I want in that section around the grid and nothing is going to manipulate how it looks. Okay, so let's talk about responsive grids. All right, so we've created our basics, 1 or 2 column, 3 column, 4 column, 5 column, 6 column. We talked about gaps. We talked about doing this on sections versus divs. Let me go ahead and delete this section. I'm going to add a brand new section to work with. And I'm going to add a div. This is going to be the same traditional approach I took before. So we're going to do grid, and we'll do a 4-column grid this time. And we're going to do a gap of, and this is a good way to write this, right? You kind of do it all at once. You say, all right, how many columns do I want here? And what does my gap need to be? So I'm going to do a gap of M. And now I'm ready to place some cells inside. So I'm going to duplicate the cell and drag it up. I'm going to duplicate it again till we fill out our grid a little bit here. Perfect. Okay. So now what we have to determine is, how do we make this grid responsive? Well, what we need to effectively do is change the structure of the grid at each breakpoint. So right now there are 4 columns, and this is on desktop. If I look at the XL breakpoint, which is 1280 pixels and below, I can see that this actually still works fairly well. And it's going to depend on what kind of content you have in your grid. If you have images, maybe this is too small for the images, and you actually need, at this first breakpoint, you need 3 columns or you need 2 columns. Maybe it's little logos for partners or something like that, and it looks perfectly fine at this size. Then you can go down to the next and see, okay, what does it look like here? And so basically what you want to do is determine, based on the content that's in your grid, at what breakpoint does my grid structure need to change? Do I need to change the amount of columns? Is basically what you're asking yourself. And so in this grid, I'm going to show you how we can change so we have 4 at the XL, 3, 2, 1. So we could do 3 at the L, we could do 2 at the M, we could do 1 at the S. This is totally arbitrary. You can do whatever you want. And remember, when you change the number of columns at any breakpoint, it's going to automatically change for all of the breakpoints below that as well. So if I put 3 right here at 992, which is the L breakpoint, let's try that. Here's the way that you do it. So it's grid double dash the breakpoint name, which is L, and then dash the number of columns that you want at the L breakpoint. So I have 4 now. I want 3 at the L breakpoint. So I'm going to put grid L3. I'm going to hit enter. And when I go down to the next breakpoint, you're going to see that I now have 3 columns instead of 2. And that's at the L breakpoint. But check this out. I'll also have 3 at the M breakpoint. And I'll have 3 at the S breakpoint. All right? So natural CSS, whatever you set at the breakpoint, is going to apply to that breakpoint and below. So now if I wanted at the M breakpoint 2 columns, I would use grid M2, right? And I can do this. Here's what's great about this. You don't have to go to the breakpoint and then make adjustments here. You can literally put all of these classes on at the exact same time. So let me show you this. I'm going to delete what's here. We've got grid 4 and gap M. So if I know in my head, as I practice this and it becomes second nature to me, I can put my div in here and I can say it's going to be a 4-column grid. At the L breakpoint, it's going to be 3 columns, so grid L3. At the M breakpoint, it's going to be 2 columns, so that's grid M2. And at the S breakpoint, it's going to be 1 column, that's grid S1. And then I'm going to put my gap on here of M. And then I'm going to put my stretch class on here because I want all of the columns to always be equal heights. You just saw me, right? Seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds. How long did that take? I now have a fully responsive grid that has equal height columns and the exact gap that I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and we're going to view this on the front end. So there's my grid. I'm going to hit into mobile mode here, and we're just going to start to see how this scales down. So I'm coming in, there's your break to 3 columns, there's your break to 2 columns, and there's your break to 1 column. So you can see in a matter of seconds, we were able to create a fully responsive grid that goes from 4 columns on desktop down to 1 column on mobile, simply by stacking classes on top of each other, right? We applied all of those classes to the parent container of your grid. And if we look at it here, just to review, you've got your grid 4. So that's what's going to happen on desktop. Grid L3, M2, S1, gap M, and stretch. Fully responsive grid from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 with the same gap. All right. So now what we have to take a look at is uneven grids. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this out of here, and I'm going to create a new wrapper for us. So we're going to add a new div. And I'm going to drag that cell into the div. And then I'm going to make sure I'm selecting my parent. So I'm not selecting the actual cell here. I'm selecting my parent. And now we're going to take a look at uneven grids. Now, just real quick here, and you should probably already know about this. If you go to automatic.css.com/cheat sheet, you're going to be able to see all of these grid classes. So if you go either to category and you choose grid, so we'll go to grids here. You can see the 2, 1, 2, 3, 3, 1, 3, 2. So you've got your normal numbers like 2 and 3 and 4. But how about uneven grids. This is 2 parts to 3 parts. Let me zoom in here. 2 parts to 3 parts, right? 2 parts to 1 part. You think of these as fractional units. That's how grids work, fractional units. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put another cell. So we just have 2 cells in here. And you can see right now they're stacked on top of each other because my parent container for them does not have a grid structure. So what I'm going to say is grid, and we can do 1, 2, which is 1 part to 2 parts. So the first part of the grid is going to be smaller than the second part. And this is the structure you get. Let me put a gap on there so that you guys can see better. There's the structure you get with a 1, 2. Now let's go to the next one. We have 1, 3. So this would be grid dash 1, 3. There's your 1 part to 3 parts. So now I'm going to remove that. We can go into the 2s now. So grid 2, 1. This is going to give me a bigger first cell and then a smaller second cell. Then we have grid 2, 3 that we can try. That's going to give me this look right here where they're closer in size, but definitely we still have a smaller one and then a bigger one. And then we go into the 3s. We can do grid 3, 1. That gets you this. And then we have a grid 3, 2. Just like that. So those are your uneven grids. Now, how do these work when you want to make them responsive? Same principle. What we want to do is either switch to, typically what you want to do is switch to even columns at one of these breakpoints. You can absolutely leave it as staggered, but if you're going to stack them, if you're going to change the number of columns, then at that point, you want to make sure that they go to an even number, right? So what I'm going to say is that this content looks pretty good at the L breakpoint, but at the M breakpoint, that's too squished. So I need to actually stack these on top of each other at the M breakpoint. I can do it here. I can go back to my desktop, whatever I want to do. It's easiest to just stay here and do it. So this is the M breakpoint, and here we want 1 columns. Right now there's 2 columns. Even though they're uneven, there's still only 2 columns, right? So I want to go from 2 to 1. So I'm going to do grid M1, and now I see that they stack on top of each other and they both become equal width. And then of course that applies to the S breakpoint as well, which means I'm good to go. So in seconds, we were able to create a uneven grid that is mobile responsive. And we'll go take a look at that on the front end, just so you can see it outside of the builder. So there's our uneven grid. As we bring in the sides of our device, we can see that right there, it switches to being a stacked layout, okay? And notice when it stacks, and you're gonna see that down here too, it maintains the gap. The same exact gap is maintained throughout. So that's really nice as well. All right, so that is uneven grids. Now we're gonna take a look at column spans and row spans, grid cell order, column starts and row starts. I'm gonna delete this section here, and we're just gonna work with this pre-done section now. All of this is, I'm gonna look at it with you. It's a 4-column grid with an M gap, and it's set to stretch so that all of the cells try to be equal height with whatever the height of the row is, okay? And I haven't made this responsive, but we can quickly do that. So if we wanna do grid L2 and then grid M1, we can do that. So we can do grid L2 and we'll do grid M1. Perfect, okay. So now and this will be helpful because when we talk about spans and things like that, we definitely need to see what happens with regard to mobile devices. So I'm going to be manipulating this cell right here, the primary colored cell. And we're going to start with column spans. So a column span allows you to take this cell and break it out of its one format, which right now it's part of 4. So it's a 1/4 of a column. And I can make it inherit the width of 2 cells or 3 cells or all of the cells, right? So I do this with call span classes, column span, right? But I shorten the word column to call because we don't want to type more than we need to. So it's call span, and then you choose your number. How many do you want this to span? If I say call span 2, then that's going to span 2 cells. Now what you're going to notice is it can't delete another grid item, right? So it's automatically going to push additional grid items to the next row down. So you're not going to lose any grid items when you do this. It's not like covering up a grid item. It's just pushing them all out of the way, and then the grid will continue to fill itself just as normal. So that's a span of 2. Let's go ahead and say I want to do a call span of 4. Now that one cell is going to take up the entire top row. Very, very, very important. And that's very powerful. If you want to do some very specialty grids, let me show you one that you might have seen before, the structure of one. So I'm going to do, and this is going to bring us into row spans next. So I'm going to do call span 2, and I'm also going to do row span of 2. And you can probably guess exactly what this is going to do. It's going to make this take up 2 columns and 2 rows. And so think about a, blog card grid or something like that, or a featured area where then there's different items spread around that featured area. This stuff is very easy to do with call span and row span classes. You can also, because you might be thinking, hey, all right, that's great on desktop, but when we get down to something like this, hey, that doesn't look so good, right? So we are at the L breakpoint. And we can just change our row span at the L breakpoint, and our column span at the row breakpoint, or at the L breakpoint. So we're going to do call span L, you guessed it, right? I only want this to take up 1 column at the L breakpoint. It's only going to span 1 column. So now it does. And because it's only spanning 1 column, it's now free to take up its 2 rows. However, I don't want it to take up 2 rows here either. I'm going to do row span, and then I'm going to do L1. And at the L breakpoint, this is now going to go back to normal, back to the way that it was when it started. So if we look at this on desktop, and in fact, it's better to look at this on the front end, because that's more of a live environment, right? So I'm going to bring this in, and you're going to see that when we get to the L breakpoint, it changes from like a specialty item to a normal item, right? Specialty item to a normal item. And the whole grid is responsive. So it's all going to behave accordingly. It is really, really important. You can break your grids if you ask it to span 4 columns and then you change at a breakpoint to 3 columns. You have a cell that's been instructed to span 4 columns, but now your grid at this other breakpoint is only 3 columns. So whenever you use spans, it's very important to undo them whenever your grid structure changes. So if you have a 4-column span and then you change to 3 columns, that cell that's spanning 4 needs to be changed to 3 at that same breakpoint. That's the only caveat. But it's a natural caveat, right? You gave this cell an instruction. It's going to hold on to that instruction until you tell it otherwise, right? So if you instructed the grid to be 4 columns and this item to be 4 columns, and then you change the grid to 3 columns, but don't change the item to 3 columns, you're going to have somewhat of a broken grid. You're going to have undesirable results, let's say. So make sure that you always reset your spans whenever you use them. I'm going to go ahead and take off our call span and our row span. And then I'm going to also take off the call span L1 and the row span L1. And we're basically back to where we started. Now we can look at responsive grid cell order. There's really, if we go to the cheat sheet and we type in order, okay, and I think I'm in grid, so I'm going to have to reset this out. Okay, perfect. And order, double dash, there we go. So you can see that we have order first and order last, and then we have a way to change these at each breakpoint, okay? So what I can say is I want this to be last on desktop, okay? So we're going to say order last, and I'm going to hit that, and you can see that it jumps all the way to the end of the grid. But at the L breakpoint, I want it to be first, so I'm going to say order L, order first L, just like this, and it's going to jump to the top at the L, but at the S, I want it back at the bottom. So I'm going to say order last, and we're going to go S at the S breakpoint, okay? So now watch this behave. Now, this isn't anything you would really want to do, but I'm showing you the granular level of control that you have over these items. So, and obviously, you've been in a situation, well, I'll show you the situation in just a minute that you'll commonly run into. Okay, so it's last right now. As we start to scale it down, there it is. It's first. As I continue to scale it down, it's still first. And there's the S breakpoint. It's now last, okay? So I'm giving it these order instructions at different breakpoints. This is very, very, very powerful for you. And here's a use case where it would probably come in very handy. So I'm going to delete that entire grid. In fact, I don't want to delete that entire grid. Let me go back. That would be a mistake because we're gonna need that again in a minute, and I don't want to rebuild the whole thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this. So I have it down there again, and then I am going to just delete this container out of here. So now I'm gonna add a new div, fresh, clean slate, and I'm going to make this. Let's use a staggered grid. So let's do grid. We could do. Let's see. We want to do 3, 2, or do we want to do 2, 3? Let's do 3, 2, and let's go ahead and add an image, and let's go ahead and add a div. Perfect. And then I'm going to select my wrapper again, and I'm going to put the stretch class on there because I want this to be equal heights. And then I'm going to put my gap class on there, which this time I'm going to go with like XL. We're going to go with a much bigger gap. Perfect. And then I'm just going to put some content in here. So we're going to do a heading. We're going to change that to an H2. We're going to throw a little text in there, and we're going to throw a little link for a call to action. So we'll do a text link. Perfect. And then I'm going to say that this is feature number 1. We're getting a little bit of lag in Oxygen's builder here. This is going to be call to action. Sometimes when I'm screen recording, this gets a little janky. Owl S to give us equal spacing in this section. And then, you know what? I need some lorem ipsum here to fill in some text. So this looks like a real thing that we're working on here. Perfect. There we are. And then what I want to do is we're going to use one of our centering classes. So I'm going to do center Y, and that's going to bring that text right to the center of this div. I'm centering across the Y axis. All right, so I have feature 1. Let's actually throw a real image in here. And it's the only image I have. So we'll just continue using this image over and over and over again. I'll slap a rounded class on that image, and that'll give me a nice rounded borders effect. And there's my feature column. And then what I'm going to do is duplicate that column again and again. And then I'm going to put an owl class on this entire section to space this out. We'll do XL. So now I've got all my feature cards spaced out. And what I want to do is I want to create a staggered effect, right? Where I have an image on the left and text on the right, and then text on the left and an image on the right, and so on. And it goes down like that. And I'm going to do this manually. Now, I'll give you a hint. We are coming up with a way to make this completely automatic for you. It's a really good feature. It's in development right now, but I'm not going to talk too much about it. But for right now, you can still do this manually. So if I want to move this feature 1 over to the left-hand side, effectively, I want to switch these columns. All I have to do is the order first class. So I'm selecting that entire cell, and I'm going to say order first. And this is going to put this in the first position, okay? So that does exactly like that. Now, you may want to change the grid structure here. So from grid 3, 2, we go grid 2, 3. And that's going to give you the same size image over here. But I've effectively changed and flip-flopped the order of that content. Now, the thing is we don't want this to stay like this. Let's see, I also want to put let's choose a breakpoint for all of these. So I'm going to say grid L. So grid L, we're going to go to 1 column like this. And then this is going to be a grid L1 as well. So at the L breakpoint, and you're going to see the problem we're going to run into here. So grid L1. So all of these are responsive now. What we don't want is image, text, text, image, image, right? What we effectively have is, on desktop, swapping the order of those items was great, but on mobile, not so great. So we have the power, right? We've already seen this. We have the power to change the order back at any other breakpoint. So I said that, hey, at the L breakpoint, or at the desktop breakpoint, I want this to be ordered first. At the L breakpoint, I want it to be ordered last. So we're going to say order last, and then we're going to choose L. Bam. So now let's go to the front end. Let's check out how we're looking. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh here. So there's my grid. Looks great on desktop. It's got that nice staggered effect that I was going for. Now, as I bring this in, we're going to see what happens at the L, and there we go. It's all responsive, and look, everything is in the proper order. So we have image, text, image, text, image, text. That's exactly what we were going for. Very, very, very easy to accomplish with CSS Grid with these utility classes, all right? And why? Because we have control over responsive grid cell order. All right, the next thing we have to look at is responsive column starts and responsive row starts. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that section. We won't need it anymore. We're going to go back to this section here. And I want to clear out all the instructions that we've given this cell right here, so we can get it back to where it started. Okay, so we need to see what happens if I column start and row start something. Now, this is even less of a use case, but we wanted you to have the power to do this. And this is part of some upcoming power that you're going to have that's going to allow you to create overlapping elements with CSS Grid, with automatic CSS. Lots and lots of good stuff coming. So if I do call start, remember there was call span and row span. Now I can have call start and row start. I can say, hey, I want this cell right here to start at the second column. So that's call start 2, and it starts at the second column now. And what this does is it leaves a blank column. Whenever you use starts, it's going to leave a blank column. And that's just how CSS Grid works, okay? But if I did, let's say that this was somewhere else in this grid, like here. Okay, let's see if I can drag and drop an oxygen. Come on, drag and drop an oxygen. Okay, we'll just leave it there. Whatever, it's fine. Let's say I wanted that's where that item is in our grid, right? But at the L breakpoint, I actually want it to start in the first row. So I can say row start double dash L, and then I can choose which row I want it to start in. We'll do 1. So at the L breakpoint, this should start in row 1. So we're going to go down to the L breakpoint, and we're going to see that it now starts in row 1. All right, so I can change the position with something like that. What about column start? Right now it's in the 4th column, right? So, and if we go to L, let's go to L, it's in column 1. All right, so let's see if we can go call start L2. So we want to start at L in the first row, but in the second column. So let's go down to L, and you can see there it is in the second column, but it's in the first row. And that's only at the L breakpoint and below, right? It's going to stay in that position at all the below breakpoints, but at the above breakpoints, it's going to be wherever it started out. Okay, and you can give these whatever instructions you want. You have the ability to start cells at any breakpoint. Start them at different columns at any breakpoint. You obviously have the order first and order last property. So this is the basics of CSS Grid with automatic CSS. It's simply adding and removing various utility classes. And because of the cheat sheet, some of this stuff may be very, very new to you, but because of the cheat sheet, I'm going to take this out right here. You have the ability to come in here and say, okay, show me all grid classes. Show me all grid spans. I want to see how I can do column spans and row spans. Show me how I can do grid order, and I can see all of my order classes. In fact, you can even copy. You can just click them, and it'll copy them to your clipboard. So you have grid order, you have grid spans, you have your grids. And once you've done it a few different times, and especially once you've started playing with the spans and the starts and the orders, you're going to see the true power of how you're able to whip up fairly, complex grids with no knowledge of CSS Grid. You don't have to know how to write any of the CSS involved in this stuff. You don't have to use Oxygen's grid builder, which can't even do some of this stuff that I just showed you. It's simply adding and removing utility classes. And you're doing that mostly on the parent container, but sometimes at the cell level too, just like we saw with the spans and the order properties and things like that. Again, we have a great community with tons of people, dedicated support specialists, but also tons of really knowledgeable and talented users. If you have any questions about using Grid with automatic CSS, or you have any struggles trying to achieve a specific thing, Grid, by the way, is not like the end all be all. It's sometimes Flexbox is better than Grid for certain things, but very often Grid is much more powerful, right? And much more consistent. And so what I'm getting at is if you need any help, we have the ACSS community available to you. You have dedicated sports specialists, and then you have all of the talented people who are in the community. They are more than willing to help you, and I'm active in there as well. So if I see your question, I might even jump in and help you. That's how we do things around here. So I'll see you guys down in the comments. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit thumbs up. It doesn't get any easier than this, guys.